Hello everyone. This is Amir, and I'm gonna be talking to you today about housing policy. Housing in the U.S. Housing in the U.S. has so many different problems, and it varies a lot from one region to another. In cities, for example, such as New York and Los Angeles, the major housing problems would be like affordability and inability of the private sector to produce enough housing to keep up with the increasing demand. In some other cities, such as Philadelphia, for example, housing is abandoned. Florida, where we live, has the highest rent cost burden rate in the U.S., and that issue is actually even worse in Gainesville, um, where we are located at this point. So a problem can housing problems can vary a lot from one place to another. Public housing, if you remember, this is where we introduced the whole idea of public housing and the revolution or evolution of housing in week 2. And we talked about how public housing was a result from the increased population, the growth in the population. And also, public housing was established to provide a decent and safe rental housing for low income families and elderly and other people with disabilities. There are approximately 1.2 million households living in public housing units, and they're all managed by 3,300 public housing agencies, or what we call BHAs. Public housing comes in all different sizes and shapes. So you would find it from a single family house all the way to high-rise apartments. So we have a huge variety of properties that fall within a public housing category. Public housing in Gainesville area, for example, there's 8 different properties and 4 public housing in the city, and these are some of those. And now I just want to remind you about some of the definitions that you covered last week. So last week you covered a lot of topics with Jason, and you talked about the private property, and you talked about rules and responsibilities, how the government, a bit about the rules of the government, private sector, and non-profit organization within the housing market. And you identified cost burden to be as anyone spending more than 30% of the household income on rent, and that becomes severe when the percentage goes to 50 or higher. So just keep in mind those 2 definitions, because a lot of the content that we're going to be covering afterwards, and a lot of the policies within the U.S. Is actually based on those 2 categories. Anyone who's interested in housing issues in the U.S. have definitely heard of HUD. So HUD is, for some of you who wouldn't know, is the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is an executive branch of the U.S. federal government, and it started as a house and home financing agencies in the mid-60s. As part of the Great Society program to develop and execute policies on housing. Nowadays the HUD is performing much better than it used to be. In the mid-90s, actually, the Congress was seriously questioning whether to disband HUD or not. They wanted to end it and shut it down. And even a very famous article came out from New York Times in 1995 was talking and discussing the poor performance of HUD. The article was the year that housing died, and you can just go back and Google that and read it. It's a bit long article, but it shows where the housing problem was within that era. So HUD budget, when it comes to budget and funding, so this chart is showing basically this year and the past 2 years of the budget were allocated to go to HUD, and this was all under the Trump administration. So we're talking about $50 billion, basically around that range. It changes a bit from one year to another, but we stay within the $50 billion budget on a yearly basis, and this is a huge money. And that money actually comes from like 20 grant programs that supports HUD initiatives. Some of those would be housing and services, fire housing, homelessness, rental assistance, and many others. HUD income provisions. So when it comes to HUD income provisions, well, there's basically two major provisions. They were set by HUD. So when we say a very low income, as defined as a 50% of the median family income of the area, and compared to a low income, which is 80% instead of 50. So this is the two categories that you need to keep in mind, because we're going to be discussing other initiatives that done by HUD based on those two. It's also good to mention at this point that HUD is responsible for the national policy and programs that address American housing needs, that improves and develop the nation's communities, and enforce fair housing laws. Housing choices, house choice voucher programs, or what is known for Section 8. You hear a lot about Section 8, or certain complexes are designated to be a Section 8. So what is Section 8? This is basically a federal government major program for assisting very low-income families and other people with disabilities and people in need to afford decent and safe housing in the private market. And in that program, the family would basically issue a housing voucher, and that would be but at the same time, they would still be responsible about finding a suitable house unit for the that they choose, where the owner agrees to rent under that program. So not anyone would choose to rent, to be willing to get people to rent their apartment under Section 8. And we're going to be discussing about the downsides of that voucher in the upcoming slides. So rental units must meet basically a minimum standards of health and safety determined by the local public housing agency, which reports to HUD eventually. A housing subsidy is paid to the landlord directly by the public housing agency on behalf of the participating family. So they don't really give the money to the family, they just give it on behalf of the family. The family then pays the difference between the actual rent charged and the landlord, and basically if there's any difference, they will have to pay it. The housing voucher family must pay 30% of its monthly adjusted gross income for rent and utilities. You remember, this is where I told you at the beginning of the lecture that 30% of your income, if it goes to rent, this is like we call like cost burden. So basically, they were trying to get people back to that line, to the 30%. So they're trying to help anyone who falls within the severe cost burden. So they're trying to get everyone to that limit, the 30%, because when you go below it, this is where they consider you to be cost burden. So, and again, it was like, if any difference happens, or like if the family chooses a house that doesn't really cover that much, and there's like a shortage in the money, the subsidy wouldn't really pay it. The family would have to compensate the difference. Section 8, long waiting list. So Section 8 has also a lot of problems, and one of them is the waiting list. So this program trigger long or closed waiting lists. In New York City, for example, the Housing Authority has effectively shut the program down in 2010, and with no reopening inside. So in New York, the Housing Authority is not even processing waitlist applications. This is how bad it is in New York City. Other cities also, like we're going to be talking about the San Diego and California. Generally, though, we're talking now open or closed. You have a lot of waiting list on for the applicants who apply for Section 8. We talked about San Diego, one of the also like the major cities with the problems when it comes to Section 8. There's a housing commission estimates the wait time to be 8 to 10 years, with more than 50,000 households on the list. So this is like a lot of numbers. Just imagine you need to wait 10 years to get the subsidy out of the government. Other limitation for Section 8. Well, Section 8 basically issues the voucher to the landlord, so they don't really give it to the family. And that means if the family chooses to leave the house or find a different place and they have a problem with the current place, they would lose the benefit. They wouldn't really go into the same waiting line, but the process is long, even to get them to change all of that, like to move from one location to another. Other issues when it comes to developers, some of them, not everyone wants to deal with Section 8. For several reasons. One of them is non-Section 8 tenant may not want to live in that property, and this is where like some of the social discrimination happens to people who get that kind of assistance from the government. There's also stereotypes about the wear and tear concerns, the property damage. So another risk for renting to a Section 8 tenant is basically they believe that Section 8 tenants are very destructive. And also that all part of the stereotype about that subsidies in this country. So not a lot of people would rent for Section 8 tenants, or choose to even invest in that market. Vouchers also from HUD, they wouldn't really cover the security deposit, and that can also be a problem. And in some cases, landlords actually had to wait 2, 3, or 4 months to get paid by Section 8. And not everyone would be willing to wait that much to get their money back. Another limitation for Section 8, we have a yearly inspection, and then the inspectors is making basically, we talked about the health and safety standards that HUD had. So there's 13 areas that the inspector will come and take a look at, and this happens on a yearly basis. There's different categories for it. They'll have to check paint, water supply, electricity, and smoke detectors, etc. So it is also known that it's very strict standards, so it's not unusual to fail a Section 8 inspection. And all of that makes it hard for people to invest or even being willing to rent to deal with Section 8 tenants. We have the Biden-Harris housing policy agenda, and this is also one of the topics that we're going to be asking you in the following week to go back and read the Biden plan for housing, and we want you to reflect on it and try to be objective whether you supported Biden or not. Try just to be objective. So if you supported him, it doesn't really make his housing plan good, right? And also vice versa. So try to be objective about it, and we would be looking forward actually to hear what you have to say about the Biden-Harris housing policy agenda. You can just Google that, and you can go to the Biden official website, and it would be easy to find. And we go on also to provide the link for it, so that would make things easier for you. On the section 2 of the recording, we will be talking a bit about this plan and continue talking about taxes and other regulation done by the government.